Hey everybody, this is John with another installment of Think Culture. Back after a long hiatus. Welcome to my bunker. I've moved, as you can tell. That's part of the reason why I've been gone so long. Other reasons include graduating, helping my wife finish her dissertation, looking for jobs and stuff, raising our son. He's 2 now. She's pregnant again. We had a sudden death in the family. My sister passed away. Lots of things like that, but I think I can kind of settle back into a regular schedule now, and I would like to. I'm going to try to. And I want to continue doing kind of like a theory series and a current event series, but this is kind of going to be both of those things combined because since I've been gone so long, and since the last sort of few videos that I uploaded were about the pandemic and everything, I feel like I should kind of recapitulate what I was saying there, maybe articulate it in a little bit better way with hindsight. So this video is going to be reflections on our current moment. Like I said, some of that's going to be recapitulation. So hopefully it isn't boring for people who have watched before. But yeah, I'm going to talk about Foucault and Agamben mostly, and then just sort of generally what's going on. And I'll just get right into it. So in the first video related to the pandemic I explained that I was pretty pro lockdowns, and then I started reading Agamben's reflections on the subject. We started getting more data in so that we could see what was going on better, and subsequently I explained that I was being won over to Agamben's viewpoint. In the intervening period, I think he's been incredibly vindicated. I think that he's been the most spot-on commentator or public intellectual. I was actually writing an article for him, or about him, for a publication on the pandemic and his thoughts on the pandemic when my sister passed away, so I stopped. But I did a bunch of research for that and did write a little bit before stopping. So yeah, some of that knowledge may be incorporated here that wasn't in the previous videos. I wish I didn't stop it. A little bit later, Jeff Schollenberger published sort of a similar kind of article, and he's really cool. But but yeah, that kind of made it so that I wouldn't really want to continue doing that. But yeah, I wanted to rehash a little bit of it. So I'm going to start with Foucault. Foucault thinks that the sort of characteristic modality of power in traditional societies is sovereign power. That's the power to take life or let live. So the sovereign power punishes. He punishes, his punishment's directed toward the body as opposed to the soul, which is what disciplinary power will later target. And so basically there's decrees, laws, whatever, infractions are punished, and at the extreme, it's the power to take life, right? He doesn't think this goes away in modernity. Sovereign power continues to operate, but he thinks that it sort of recedes into the background. And disciplinary power starts to emerge. Disciplinary power targets the soul instead of the body. And disciplinary power, the metaphor he has for it is the panopticon. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the panopticon, you have a kind of central column surrounded by cells of prisoners, right? The panopticon's a prison. And in the central tower, you have a guard and a light on top. And so the light makes it so that all the cells can be seen from the central tower at all times. But the light occludes the person within the tower, right? So all the prisoners know that they can be watched at any moment. They can be being watched. There can be a guard there. There could be not a guard there. Whatever. They don't know. They can't see that cell, but whoever's there can see all their cells. And so Foucault's really interested in this because he thinks this sort of omnipresent threat of surveillance causes the prisoners to conform their behavior to whatever, the prison would want them to be acting like, or whatever it would want them to be doing. They discipline themselves, they train themselves, they conform themselves to whatever the sort of requisite behavioral norms are, right? And you don't even need a guard there. That's the point. Sovereign power doesn't actually have to be present. It doesn't have to be effective. Disciplinary power functions because of surveillance on the one hand, he says, and on the other hand, knowledge discourses or disciplines like academic disciplines, sociology, biology, psychology, all these things. They articulate a kind of particular vision of human subjectivity. They encode and transmit norms, etc., right? And these things have the function of transmitting the norms. The constant presence or threat of surveillance on the one hand and the disciplines on the other, so it'll be articulated within psychology, for example, that masculinity is toxic. Traditional masculinity is toxic, right? And people conform themselves to that as a norm. So masculinity is transformed, right? According to this vision of masculinity. Or you'll learn that heterosexuality is repressive. All these heterosexuals are repressed because human beings are naturally bisexual and polyamorous or whatever. So then the polycule becomes normative or, whatever. And that's how these things function, right? Not just in psychology, but in biology, sociology, criminology, everything. All these different discourses, they compel without force, right? Combined with the threat of surveillance. And they make people, as Foucault says, docile and useful. That's the goal, right? They become docile and useful to the ruling class, to power, to the state. Also in modernity, you get, according to Foucault, the emergence of biopolitics, which is the state taking an interest in populations, population statistics, demographics, birth and death rates, disease, you get public health, etc., and so forth. That kind of thing would have been unimaginable in previous eras, according to Foucault. Hobbes actually says this specifically, like the idea that the ruler, the sovereign, would care about your diet or take an interest in how much exercise you get or whatever. That would have seemed crazy. But because of this new modality of power, via disciplinary power and things like that, it becomes possible and it becomes an object of management, the management of populations, the management of individual behavior down to the smallest level, because we can be made to do it ourselves, right? Because the knowledge discourses get us to train ourselves, that we get subjectivated as a psychological subject. We start analyzing our own thoughts, being on guard against, as I said in a recent video, recent as in one of the last ones I made, that's how I think the racism stuff is functioning. We have to be on guard against, microaggressions or stereotyping or whatever. We're supposed to constantly monitor and analyze ourselves. And then, you get sort of the super ego injunctions or punishment or whatever, right? We have to become racist subjects or racial subjects, be aware of everything racial going on. We're being, tuned in to micromanage ourselves to make us docile and useful to the state, to government, in sort of the expanded sense of what Foucault means by government and governmentality. So the biopolitical sort of combines, or biopower is kind of a combination of biopolitical and biopolitics and disciplinary power, where these things get managed in a disciplinary way, but there's kind of a biopolitical agenda behind it, etc. Foucault also has another form of power, pastoral power, and in that it's like shepherding the care of the flock, etc. I don't find that particularly useful, but I'll mention it anyway. But I think Foucault is right about all this. I think that he's totally right about it. Some of the specifics and the details have shifted around a little bit, like in his narrative about sexuality, for example, right? We're supposed to be on guard against, like gay thoughts or whatever. That would be kind of like the idea. And yeah, now it's totally reversed. It used to be like the idea was to get everyone to conform themselves to normal cis heterosexuality, blah, blah. Then we had this sort of critique of that, but now it functions in a totally different way. But the underlying mechanisms of the way that it functions, I think Foucault gets right. Anyway, so Agamben takes this Foucauldian view and he builds on it a little bit. He's influenced also by Schmitt and Benjamin. In Homo sacer, he expresses a kind of different understanding of the biopolitical. Foucault thinks that modernity and biopolitics belong together. Agamben thinks that too, except that Foucault thinks that that biopolitics doesn't emerge at all until modernity, whereas Agamben thinks that the biopolitics is already present with sort of the most ancient, that it's the most kind of fundamental expression even of sovereign power. And his argument for that you find in Homo sacer, and it's through this idea of Homo sacer, which in Roman antiquity, I guess there was this law where, which was explicit in this case, where somebody could be made a Homo sacer, like a sacred man, in the sense that he was ejected from the civic juridical order, right? And he was turned thus into bare life. He exists like in the sacred space outside of the human world, outside of the bios, is the way that Agamben talks about it. He goes from being bios to zoe, to bare life, to the zoological. And so the law doesn't shield him anymore. Civic society doesn't shield him. He can be killed and it's not a crime. It's not murder, right? Because he stands outside of the legal order. And so Agamben thinks that because that sovereign power itself is founded on this, because it's always already playing with this, with Zoe as a weapon, right? It brings people into the civic community, into bios, allowing them to be human citizens with rights, with community, with norms, whatever. And then it can also decide not just to take your life, right, but to turn you into something outside of bios, right? So it already plays with the species being of man in the sense that it weaponizes species being with the threat or the inclusion of the threat of expulsion from bios or the inclusion into bios. I hope that makes sense. But so he's like, this is kind of the fundamental nature of what sovereign power does, and so this is why his argument in the wake of 9/11, which again he turned out to be vindicated about, he thinks that the metaphor of modernity is not the panopticon, but the death camp, right? The death camp as a place where, like a kind of liminal place where people don't have the shield of the juridical order, they don't have rights, etc. They're merely zoological, and the state can do with them what they want. It can grant whatever privileges it wants to them. It can take them away at a whim. It's just this chaos of we can do to you whatever we want because you're Zoe. You're not a citizen. You're not a citizen of anywhere. You're a placeless organism that we can experiment on or do whatever we want. And he was like, that's what's going to happen with things like Gitmo, etc. That is what happened with things like Gitmo. That is what happens with the national security state, right? Where behind closed doors, they can decide that you're right to privacy can be suspended without your notice, without trial, without anything. Now you're surveilled. Your right to a trial can be suspended on a whim, right? Your all your rights can just be suspended at any moment because of the threat of terrorism. And and he thinks that this suspension happens via what he calls the state of exception, which comes from Schmitt. So the declaration of the exception as applied to an individual is like the Homo sacer, right? And I think that actually required a trial. But he thinks that progressively the exception gets more and more generalized, more and more mobile, etc. And so the point here is that with the pandemic, especially, he thought that we were entering an era in which the death camp, as the metaphor, becomes mobile, universal, permanent, right? Where there's global order in which we can say no more public gatherings. We can say you have to quarantine. You're locked down. We can say no more burial rites. We can burn bodies. We can say you can't visit your family members in the hospital who are dying. We can mandate vaccines. All this stuff at a moment's notice with no legal precedent, with no legal right to do that to you. None of that, right? And we're doing it in the name of public health, So he thinks that we're sort of ratcheting up the national security state and it's becoming the biosecurity state, in which you don't have the threat of terrorism and the threat of terrorism justifying this, but much worse than that, you have the threat of illness. Not only do we need to monitor people for radical ideas or whatever, because they might become radicalized, become terrorists, whatever, but every single person is a possible vector of contagion. Your movements need to be monitored and controlled. Your freedom of movement can be suspended, etc., and so forth. Whether or not you know it, you might be contagious. You might be a source of infection, right? And that's dependent on where you've been, who you've encountered, etc. So I think that they're already coming out with apps and stuff that are monitoring where people go and who they've come into contact with and all this kind of stuff. And all this stuff is just ratcheting up. Vaccine passports were a conspiracy theory. Not so much anymore. The stuff going on in Australia, etc. So I think that he has been proven to be very correct. The fear stuff is very relevant to that, and it's interesting the way that it's also being applied to the January 6 people. The idea, particularly ominous to me, is this idea of infodemics and stuff. Yesterday I was about to record this, and I saw a headline that said the Pfizer CEO declared that people who spread COVID misinformation should be criminals, that they are criminals, right? They're thought criminals. And again, it's because every excess of power, every abuse of power is justified by the biosecurity state now. Public health, the view to American citizens, global citizens of anywhere, whatever, as a population in which disease can spread, and so they have to be managed like we're cattle or something. The sort of biopolitical stance par excellence is coming to fruition, with all the Great Reset and stuff. Early on, Agamben was talking about how, what did he say? The pandemic was planned or something like that. And people obviously deliberately misunderstood that. But he's talking about how, and I've seen this now when I was writing in the biosecurity literature and everything, that there was a lot of precedent coming up to this. And he talks about Patrick Zilberman and stuff with the avian flu in 2005. And there's a lot of literature that's it's impossible to prevent one of these biological events, right? Whether you're talking about bioterrorism or a zoonotic disease or whatever. It's simply impossible to prevent. It's impossible to predict, right? So when you have a kind of politics and culture rooted in things like fear, trauma, therapy culture, etc., in which the state is supposed to administer your health and your mental health and like have an obligation to provide you safe spaces and all this kind of stuff. In conditions like that in particular, right? And with the way that, as he talks about, we tend to the logic of the worst, right? So they'll model avian flu for the upcoming months or whatever, and they do various modeling, and they take the worst case scenario modeling, and they try to respond in the present to future anticipated threats with, again, unlimited interventions into the body politic. Yeah, it's just crazy. Yeah. But it was planned in the sense that the logic of response to these sorts of things, the logic of the worst, therapy culture, economic plans for stuff like the Great Reset, trying to restructure the economy, getting greater sort of technological access to and control over individuals, their thoughts, because it's a virus, right? I'm communicating a mind virus to you. And so that's a threat to public health potentially. We need to intervene. It's justified on the basis of public health. This could cause, worst case scenario, a January 6th meandering or whatever. So the possibilities here are really dire. I think the situation that we're in is pretty dire, and it calls for very serious thought. We've reached a kind of catastrophic apogee, right? That's what Agamben thinks. That the technological means available to us, and apparently the lack of political will to resist it on the part of the population who is scared to death and wants, the nanny state or whatever to protect me, to do everything they can to protect me, when we're all just bare life, when all of our concerns are just bare life, when all we care about anymore is my health or whatever, right? Then the state, which is engaged in health security, can do things that Nazi Germany or Stalin, Soviet Union could only have ever dreamed of, Yeah, that's the situation that we're in. It's not great. I think that Agamben has been shown to be correct, that his conception of biopolitics and what sort of perfected biopolitics looks like, the emergence of the biosecurity state as kind of the perfection of the biopolitical paradigm, etc. I think all of that stuff, he was just spot on, I don't know if I was going to say anything else here for now. I also want to talk about, within this context, Sloterdijk, because I think that's very interesting too. Like this idea that we have to immunologically secure the community. Sloterdijk has this idea that enlightenment, that modernity, that we see progressive explication of the background, right? So like radiation gets known, disclosed or unconcealed in sort of the Heideggerian parlance, and then thematized, and then we're caretaking it or whatever. On the other hand, you could have like the atmosphere, right, becomes explicit, thematized, and then you can engage in gas warfare, right, in which it's the atmosphere itself which is the target of your attack. The conditions which make life livable, right? So there's this constant explication of the background conditions necessary for human life. and they get thematized, they become political problems, etc. And so the pandemic stuff is also interesting to me, like from this Sloterdijkian perspective, because again, it's like the virological dimension of human life, the bacteriological dimension of human life. All these things are becoming more explicit. We're being trained, disciplined to perceive them, to respond to them, etc. Like when I go into a place now and it's crowded at all, I feel like, oh wow, there's a lot of people here. Like there could be so many contagions in the air or whatever. I could get sick, blah, blah. Like I'm thinking about that. Whereas in the past, I never thought about that. You would go into a crowded place and be like, whoa, this is a happening place or whatever, right? Now we're learning to discipline ourselves as health subjects to such an extent that, I walk into a busy place and I'm like, I should probably leave. I don't want to get into such close contact with so many people or whatever, because the background conditions of life in terms of health, sickness, virus, particles, etc., all those things have been made really explicit. They're at the forefront of our minds. And this is like Sloterdijk will talk about the breath and how we share breath, and the sort of smallest unit is the biune and all this kind of stuff. And now we're like, the breath that we exchange with each other has become explicit as potentially pathological, which it always was, but it's also life-giving, right? But it's life-threatening. And so now it's become a political problem, like who we share breath with, who we get into close contact with. There's a lot there. I want to talk about Sloterdijk and the pandemic and stuff later, when I've sort of more, concisely configured my understanding of the relationship between those two things and what's going on. But I think that it's very interesting because his idea, like in spheres, he calls it a general immunology, right? Way before the pandemic, general immunology. And he means it like in symbolic terms, but not just in symbolic terms. But, and he wants to talk about life-giving illusion, like the symbolic universes that we construct with each other, the spheres, the symbolic spheres that we enclose ourselves in so that we can live with one another and have communities and stuff. And it's like there's this metaphor also of like the bubble is filled with air, with breath, right? And it's sustained as a self-enclosed atmospheric unit that's animated by aspiration or whatever, and just the pathologization of the breath, I think, is dire and highly important, and signifies maybe a movement in the direction of what he's talking about, which is like we need to have kind of like immunopolitics. We need to have air conditioning in this metaphorical sense become a explicit theme of political discourse. And it's like that discourse is happening, but it's happening, behind the scenes in the double government. I read Michael Glennon's book too, for the paper I was going to write. But anyway, I'll stop it there. I think there's just a tremendous amount here that needs to be thought through very seriously, very not objectively, but just in earnest, etc. And people still aren't really doing it. It's like the Heideggerian thing. We live in the most thought-provoking time, and never have people been so thoughtless before. And the most thought-provoking thing is the way that everyone is thoughtless in the face of the most tremendous transformation of the human world that has ever taken place. We stand at the precipice of having the very notion of humanity or the human subject being totally demolished. I mean, we are already, as Agamben says, we've seemingly moved totally from bios to zoe, in our thinking, in the state and the political communities that we live in, we're all merely zoological now. The civic order has disappeared. The legal juridical order has disappeared. All we care about is our life and our health, life preservation. I remember this moment early on. I think he was like deputy governor or something like that, lieutenant governor in Texas early on, and he was on Tucker's show. And I think this is when I supported the lockdowns and stuff, but he came on the show and he was like, I would rather risk my life or sacrifice my life as an elderly man who's lived his life in America or whatever, so that my grandchildren have an opportunity to live in the same kind of place that I lived in, right? I don't want to sacrifice the legal juridical order. I don't want to sacrifice bios for my Zoe, for my bear. The concern of just my survival as an organism is outweighed by the bios. It's more important to preserve that. I think that was a important thing to say, and people thought he sounded crazy, but I don't think he sounded crazy, not anymore at least. But anyway, I'll call it good there. I want to start the spheres stuff pretty soon. I think my notes are basically done for it. I think I'm going to start doing classics of philosophy stuff. In this interim, I've sort of read a lot. I read The Republic again, for example, and I would really like to talk about The Republic at length on here. Just lots of stuff, The Prince, Meditations, whatever, like classics of philosophy. They maybe even could be its own sort of series, like contemporary philosophy, classic philosophy, current events, whatever. Anyway, I think that was a okay sort of welcome back episode. Just sort of unstructured ruminations on the world that we find ourselves in today, and why we need to think culture. Anyway, take care. See you next time.